Our reading today will be from Exodus 3, 1 through 15. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So, I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So there we were, sitting at our regular spot, soaking up whatever warmth we could as the marine layer rolled over us. Having just a kind of meandering conversation the way that friends do as you're waiting for your coffee to arrive. Disciples talked with Jesus around the Sea of Galilee. We had Alta coffee on the Newport Peninsula. I've been meeting with Craig like this somewhat regularly for the better part of 3 years, and we'd gotten close over that time. Somewhere around the first refill, I asked him about his kids. Hadn't heard much about them in a while. They were 18 months apart, just like my kids were, and his daughter had just graduated from high school. And he always, as we were meeting, would light up by telling stories about, all of her accomplishments in water polo or his in lacrosse. But that was before an affair led to a long silence that the relationship still had not quite recovered from. So when I asked about his daughter and her plans in high school, he just got quiet. And eventually, in place of silence, tears formed behind his sunglasses as he stared into his coffee mug. He was trying to find those words, but he couldn't. The way that emotion sometimes eclipses your speech when you're trying to get the words out. Ours was the kind of pastoral relationship that began in crisis. Craig did not have any sort of relationship to church, but he knew that he needed to change, and my office was the first one that he just happened to stumble into as he came into the church on his way home from work on a random Tuesday afternoon. Somewhere along the way, along years of therapy and regular meetings like this one, and a men's group that loved him fiercely, he had an encounter with God that shattered him. And years later, he bore very little resemblance to the cocky guy who stumbled into my office looking for a quick fix. But this pain, this loss of relationship with his kids, the husband and father that he always assumed he would be, but he could not forgive himself for not being, that was the place inside of him that grace still hadn't reached. And we all tend to have some places like that, some area where we cannot forgive ourselves and where we believe that God cannot forgive us either. And we tend to hold that part of ourselves at a distance, and whether we're conscious of it or not, we hold it outside of the reach of God's embrace. And then you find yourself out on an ordinary day, and a simple question begins to unearth all the things that you would rather not let see the light of day. And we all got a story like that. And Moses' confrontation with God at the burning bush is about how God enters into that story. It's about who God is, about who we are, and about ultimately how God draws us into his work of renewing and reshaping the world. We're in this series this summer called Encountering God, about ordinary people whose lives are changed by a moment, by an event that set them on a new trajectory and gave them a sort of new sense of horizons for their lives. And the life of Moses contains several dramatic encounters, maybe more so than anyone else in the Bible, but the setup to his story is just as important. Born into oppression, but spared from that bondage and adopted into a life of wealth and comfort in the royal household of Egypt, Moses lived a life of luxury and privilege born on the backs of his ancestors. And so as he grew up, he kind of wrestled with these two identities. And I have to imagine that there are times when he would look out on the courtyard from the palace and survey the landscape that was going on below him. And he would ask himself questions like, are those my brothers buckling under the weight of those bricks? Is that my mother over there tearing her hands as she cuts the straw? And so he carried this complicated story into his adulthood, learning to manage the tension until it mounted in a moment of rage directed toward an Egyptian slave driver. He kills his oppressor, but he never lived among or suffered with the oppressed. And then the next day when he goes to claim his identity as one of the people, they ask him, are you here to kill us the way that you did the Egyptian? And suddenly the thing that he tried to hide gets blown up publicly. And his first plan to be a hero fails. So he runs away into the desert, disillusioned and determined to live a quiet life, free from the burden of needing to make a difference. That's chapter 2 of Exodus. And there's a 40-year gap between chapter 2 and chapter 3. And just when you think that the scene is going to shift entirely away from Egypt and the problem of Pharaoh and slavery, and settle into the quiet life that Moses is going into in Midian, we have this little echo that resounds throughout the Bible story. Chapter 2 ends with this. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Scene cuts to 2 decades later, or 4 decades later. The young fugitive has grown into this weathered, bearded man, and this is when God comes calling. It began as just another ordinary day at work. Moses was doing exactly what he had been doing since he fled Egypt and entered into this quiet life in Midian. He was in the wilderness, far from where he thought he would be, tending sheep that weren't even his. Horeb is the name of the mountain he was nearby. In Hebrew, it means a dry wasteland. As if that isn't a metaphor for life. But it's there, in this dry, ordinary place, that God calls his name from the burning bush. Take off your sandals, for this place that you are standing is holy ground. And you gotta wonder how many times Moses passed by that place. How many times he saw that bush and assumed it's just a bush? But when God comes present, even ordinary places can become holy ground. Maybe you've come to a spot in life where the whole project of doing something significant has led to one discouragement after another. You've been hurt by the very people you're trying to help. The optimism of your youth has lost its shine, and you tell yourself it's time to stop swinging for the fences and just settle down into an ordinary life. And maybe like Moses, that looks like getting married, having children, settling into a comfortable routine. But Moses' story tells us that even ordinary lives can be made holy. After this dramatic introduction, God tells him why he's here. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them. And I imagine as Moses heard those words, something like hope began to swell up inside of him. There's this deep place inside of him that longs for liberation and desires justice. That's what led him to this place to begin with. And these are words that echo all throughout the Bible story. God hears the misery of his people, and God comes down. This theme stretches back to Genesis when Cain kills his brother Abel, the first act of injustice in the Bible. God breaks into the story and says, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." It's a way of saying that injustice makes a sound that God hears. The word for outcry in Hebrew is se'aka, and it means the cry of the distressed. It's the same word that we hear throughout the Exodus story. The cry that reached God's ears is the sound of injustice. And like a movie with a familiar orchestral theme that plays throughout and underscores all the action, there is this tune playing throughout the Bible's pages. Injustice makes a sound that God hears. God hears the groaning of his people in chapter 2, and then he says it again to Moses in chapter 3, almost the exact same words as if to say, hey, don't miss this. God hears and remembers the covenant that he made with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. And so he looked on the Israelites and he is concerned about their suffering. And this melody plays all throughout the Bible storyline in bits and pieces in different eras with different characters. And then it adds another chord called covenant. When God makes the promise with Abraham and Sarah, who were unable to have children, they wouldn't just have a child. No, they would have the birth of a nation. And through that nation, God would show the whole world what he's like. And as the sound of injustice plays on, so does the counter melody of God's covenant. He hears the sound of injustice and he remembers. He remembers Jacob in the wake of Laban's deception. He remembers Joseph as he languishes in prison. Whenever it is that injustice reaches God's ear and the people cry out in prayer, we are told again and again throughout the Bible that God remembers. But this is not to say that God ever forgot. In the words of the priest Fleming Rutledge, memory, remembrance in biblical thought does not mean calling to mind. Remembering means present and active. Remembrance is not a memorial of God's saving action in the past, but an appropriation of that same saving power in the present. And so to say that God remembers is always an act of grace. It is a declaration that even in the harshest of conditions, God will act decisively. This is good news for those who struggle under poverty and violence and oppression and war. Hold on to hope because God remembers. He hears the cries of the brokenhearted. It's good news for those who are trapped in circumstances of loneliness or despair and it feels like endless darkness. They can expect light to break in because God remembers. And those who suffer under the yoke of an illness that will not relent, grief that they cannot bear, systems that they cannot change, God remembers. Take heart. God has seen your affliction and heard your cries and has come down to us. This is the heart of the gospel. This is the work that Jesus is about to enter into the mess of this world, whether it is the mess that we have made or the mess that has been made for us. It is a call to hold on and take heart. But that response may not come on the timetable we prefer or in a method that we would approve of. Moses may have imagined that God's coming down to bring freedom would look a little bit different than it did. But this is where the conversation takes an interesting turn. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And Moses responds to this call with two objections, both in the form of a question. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And secondly, suppose I go to the Israelites and tell them the God of your fathers has sent me to, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? Two questions. Who am I? And who are you? So I'm sitting there with Craig, offering whatever consolation I can. He's grieving the loss of his relationship with his kids, the life that he's living, and where it all went wrong. The husband and the father that he wasn't, and the man that he had become, at least in his mind, too late, though. And he apologized profusely as he wiped away the tears, that feeling of being caught out in the open, of wanting desperately to hide. There's actually a word for that. That part of ourselves that we keep hidden away from the harsh gaze of others, and at least in our imagination, out of God's sight. And it's called shame. And we've all felt it. Psychologists tell us that it's notoriously difficult to define. Words like humiliation, embarrassment, indignity, disgrace, they touch on aspects of it, but ultimately they're just symbols of what it is that we actually experience in our souls. Because shame is not just a feeling that we have, it is a sense that we carry. It's a story that we go on to tell about ourselves. It's the kind of insecurity that wraps us around its axle and works its way into our identity. Neuroscientist Kurt Thompson comes close with this. Researchers have described shame as a feeling that is deeply associated with a person's sense of self, apart from any interactions with others. Guilt, on the other hand, emerges as a result of something I have done that negatively affects somebody else. Guilt is something I feel because I have done something bad. Shame is something I feel because I am bad. It's this disintegrating force that gets into our bones and starts to tell a story throughout our lives. And often it's a story that we would disagree with cognitively, but we cannot help but actively live it out. Brennan Manning tells the story of an elderly nun who had served faithfully all the days of her life. And then at 78, after he had finished speaking at a weekend retreat, she shows up at his hotel room at 3 o'clock in the morning. Says, I've never told anyone this in my life. When I was 5 years old, my father used to crawl into bed with me at night with no clothes on. She goes on to describe the unspeakable abuse that she endured throughout her childhood, that she had carried in silence for over 7 decades. And now, as an elderly woman, here she was, finally unbandaging a wound that she had hidden from sight, that she had spent her whole life living in response to. And there are endless varieties of the story that shame tells. What they have in common is this, that it's fear, not love, running the show. Shame is a response when you showed your mother a 92% on your math test, and she looks at you coldly and asks, what happened to the other 8%? It introduces a storyline into your body that you don't work hard enough. Shame is the way that boys started to stare at you and the girls started to withdraw from you when you were 13, when suddenly no longer you felt like a person, but a collection of body parts to be rated, ogled at, sculpted, highlighted, or covered up. It's the way that shopkeeper made you feel that time you were out on vacation as he followed you uneasily throughout the store when you were browsing at clothes and introduced this narrative of suspicion about people like yourself and people of other racial backgrounds. None of us are strangers to the stories. And as kids, we're warned not to tell lies. But the ones that end up shaping us the most aren't just the lies that we tell, they're the ones that we let inside, the ones that we live as if they were true, and then sooner or later they start to become true because of the way we've lived for so long. And when those lies don't meet redemption, the story just loops and the wound just keeps echoing. It's all another way of forgetting who God is and forgetting who we are. And that's exactly where Moses finds himself alone in Midian, living a life that looks like exile, trying to forget the failures of his past. And in the grip of shame, we ask the same questions that Moses asks of God at Mount Horeb. Who am I and who are you? First time I can remember feeling shame, I must have been about 7 or 8 years old. We were at home playing Trivial Pursuit in the living room. My mother, my brother, my father, and I. And I remember it being just a generally light mood. We didn't have a whole lot of game nights as a kid, but when we did, it was kind of like a thing. And I had 2 pieces in my Trivial Pursuit pie. I remember that. So I got a few questions right. But then I must have given a few wrong answers in a row because my dad started laughing. And it seemed kind of like a strange laughter, so I asked him rather innocently what he thought was so funny. I wanted to see if I could keep the mood going on. But he just looked at me and said, I just can't believe how dumb you both are. How can you get these questions wrong? My brother burst into tears. I made some excuse about not feeling well, and I remember my mom raising her voice as I ran into my bedroom to hide. And I know that's really dramatic, but it's as clear as a movie reel in my head. My dad was the guy who taught me to ride a bike and how to hit a baseball, and all of a sudden I did not know who I was to him or who he was to me. And a story started to form in my heart. Not good enough. Don't live up to your name, man. That's shame. I was unrecognizable to myself, and my still-forming brain had no way of understanding all of the stories that he was living out that went into that moment or any of the factors that went into the complexity of that interaction. But I remember that before that day, school was a place where I felt like I was celebrated and I was belonged, and suddenly I was no longer sure, but I desperately wanted approval. And I remember later that year nervously handing my dad the principal's award I won for writing, and all I really wanted to ask this man that I loved, and I didn't know how to ask, was, who am I and who are you? 23 years later, it was shame that landed me in the office of the spiritual director talking about my anger. The defining moment there took place when I had snapped harshly at 3-year-old Graham, who had suddenly kicked my seat for the 100th time in the back seat of our Honda Odyssey. I was riding on my way back from visiting my parents on this solo trip with my kids, who were 2 and 3 at the time. I crushed the first week as a solo dad. And then I was supposed to be enjoying them for a week of vacation out at my parents' house in Arizona. But the stress of work leading up to that point, my own unmet expectations about taking my kids to their grandparents for the very first time, just spilled out of me, and I lost my temper making unrealistic demands on a 3-year-old. And before long, I found myself pulled over on the side of the road, holding on to my kids weeping. They were fine. I was a mess. And suddenly I could see myself. And how wide was the gap between the story of who I wanted to be and the story that I was actually living out. And I could see how narrow the gap was between who I never wanted to be and who I was afraid I might be. The wounds that we don't allow to heal become the places from which we wound others. So here I am, pastor who writes and speaks about how to live a centered life in the loving gaze of the triune God, fumbling through words how to describe the distance between myself and the chasm that has opened up between the story I want to believe is true and the story that I'm actually living. And it boils down to these 2 questions. Who are you, God? And who am I in light of who you are? Now, both of those stories have a redemptive ending. But shame is always the enemy nipping at your heels never running out of creative ways to pull your attention. Who am I? Who are you? God takes these two questions and uses them as a means to draw us into his work. And for Moses, this burning bush is not just some abstract mystical experience. It is a startling confrontation of the very best kind. Because God enters into Moses' shame. The life that he tried to run from, all the way to Midian, Moses is what it looks like when the roots of shame are given time to flower. Who am I, a fugitive shepherd, to go into the presence of Pharaoh? I mean, he longs for everything that God has shown up to talk to him about at this point. He tried that before. He was ready to lead the revolution, but instead of his story bending toward the heroic arc, he fled, hiding his face. No, you've got the wrong guy. And it's the question that we ask. Who am I in the face of the world's needs? You might think I'm just a researcher or a student or a lawyer or I'm somebody trying to finish a thesis. You might think I'm retired and my best years of contribution are behind me. But God hears the cries of his people and he remembers the promises that he never forgets, but we seem to. And he chooses to find a man whose shame was exposed and whose calling got lost along the way, and God calls him by name. And to these realistic objections that Moses poses, God does not offer a detailed plan. Instead, he offers a promise. I will be with you. And that just leads to the next question. Well, then who are you? And again, not a long explanation, but a declaration. I am Yahweh. I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. I am the God who has made himself known, the God who hears the cry of injustice and remembers his covenant, the God who has made himself known to your ancestors, the God that you have largely forgotten. And it's a name, of course, but it is an invitation to trust. To trust that while the names and the circumstances change, the God who hears the cries of the oppressed will act decisively on their behalf. And this ultimately is how God goes about restoring the world. He restores the world through people he restores. And the two can never be separated. God wants to heal his people who are suffering oppression through a decisive response to their cries and their prayers. So he finds Moses still buckled by a 40-year-old failure. The one who is hiding out from both the oppressed and the oppressor alike, who has staked out an ordinary life that never had to confront that part of him that grace cannot touch, but also never has the chance to heal from it. And God hears the cry of injustice and he picks the most unlikely candidate to do something about it. This is God's plan A for the world. Shortly after the first Easter, Jesus appeared to his disciples behind locked doors and assured them that death was not the final word through his resurrection. He allowed Thomas to touch his wounds. He allowed each of them to know who he was. And each time he ended with an invitation to go and be part of this world suddenly made strange and alive and new through the power of his resurrection. But instead of stepping into this new world, they go back to the life that they knew. I'm going fishing, Peter says. We'll go with you, the disciples say. In other words, they do what most of us do whenever we're dealing with pain and shame. We fall back on our areas of competency, the things that we can control. Now, most of the action in that narrative centers on the person of Simon Peter because he has got a unique place in that drama. He was the one who first dared to acknowledge that Jesus was God's Messiah. The one who said that even if the other ones fail you, I will not. He was the one who was given the nickname Peter, which means the rock. The one who Jesus said, you are the one on whom I will build my church. But in light of everything that happened, how can he be anyone's rock? He doesn't know how to do that, but he knows how to fish. So he's out there on the boat. And I wonder if in all that time waiting for the nets to fill up, he just has that scene in the courtyard of his denials playing back over and over again through his head. And I wonder if he's thinking, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead just like he said he was going to, and that is great news for the rest of the world. But what does that mean for the man who cursed and denied him? And maybe some of those questions are the ones that hit closest to you, not whether or not the resurrection or God's call is true on some grand scale. It's the question of, does this God even want to know me? Can he enter into my story with all the shame and the pain and the guilt that I carry? Well, to one degree or another, Peter, Moses, they're all of us. Because we all have this place where we feel like we're standing apart from the community, apart from the reach of God. And so Peter just passes his hours at work trying to keep his mind occupied. And then out there on the beach, there's a fire. It's not a burning bush, but it's a place from which Jesus calls him out by names. Simon, do you love me? Simon, do you love me? Simon, do you love me? 3 questions for 3 denials, each time with an invitation to join in the healing of the world. And so in the middle of his shame, Peter the denier becomes Peter the rock on whom Jesus does build his church. The one who denied Jesus is the one who preaches the sermon on Pentecost where the Spirit comes down and begins the healing of the world. Friends, this is how God works. He restores the world through restored people. And the truth is that grace is stronger than the shame that we carry. It's just another thread in the tapestry of injustice that Jesus came to unweave. That moment that you stop trying to protect yourself from being in ever again the person that you've never stopped trying to prove that you're not, that is not the last true thing about you. The last true thing about you is that Jesus' resurrection means that God will enter into all of that pain. I love how the novelist Frederick Buechner put it. The last thing is the best. It is the power from on high that comes down into the world, that wells up from the rock bottom worst of the world like a hidden spring. Can you believe it? The last best thing is the laughing deep in the hearts of saints, sometimes our hearts even. Yes, you are terribly loved and forgiven. Yes, you are healed. All is well. You see, what we learn from Moses in the burning bush is a lot of things, but it is at least this, that God's calling in your life is greater than you dare to imagine. And it's the grace of his presence that will equip you and empower you to carry out that calling, even in the places of your deepest shame. I mean, grace is a hard thing to get a handle on. Maybe the hardest thing in the world, because every other storyline will try to convince you that you've got to find creative ways to cope, and everything else within you and around you will convince you you've got to find some other way to become lovable in your own eyes, but grace ends up being the only way in. And this is maybe more to the point that until you see your life and all of its complexity and doubt and failure and narratives, until you see that that life can be a site of holiness, you will not be ready to heal or to hear God's call to be part of the healing of the world. Turns out it's never just a bush or an office or a lab or a classroom or a line in the van pool or diapers to be changed or dishes to be washed. Ordinary lives can be made holy by the gift of God's presence. And his presence is more than your shame or your failure, even more than your ability that will allow his work to be done. Moses fled into the wilderness and came to Mount Oreb, a name again that means wasteland, but Moses ended up calling it the mountain of God. And it was a place that he would come to time and time again, a thin place where heaven touches earth. Not because there was anything uniquely important about that geography, but because it was a place where God met him. And that means you don't have to go out looking for holy ground. The place where you are exposed and made vulnerable. The place where you are confronted with your shame and met with grace. The place where you learn that grace is stronger than your shame. That makes it holy ground. That's the place where shame is healed and a call is received. The place where God meets you is that holy ground. You don't need to go somewhere to encounter God. He'll meet you wherever you are. And it does not matter what you are running from, because there is more grace in God than there is shame in you. God still wants you. He loves you. He is not done with you yet. Amen.